going. All right. Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here tonight. I know that in weeks ahead, we're going to have other people joining us as well. And I know that as weeks go by, you all might need to miss from time to time, and that's understandable. Almost anything that is 10 weeks long these days is probably going to eventually end up with a conflict for you. So that's okay. I'm going to be recording these, and especially from tonight, I'm recording from the start. So, anybody watching this later can get all the information that I'm going to mention about the book and all that stuff. In future weeks, we're not going to start recording quite right away. And I'll explain why that is in a moment. But I'm so glad that you're here and that you are interested in sharpening your skills for teaching and preaching, because there are few blessings that we have in life that are greater than the opportunity to teach somebody from the Word of God. That is such a privilege, and it is well worth our time to think about, how can I improve in this? How can I do better when I have an opportunity to share truth with somebody from the Word? So this time is going to be well worth your investment, I believe. So yeah, let me talk about the book here. I see several of you already have your copies of it. Biblical Preaching from Haddon Robinson is what we're going to be going through. This one is the second edition. I don't know if anybody else, I think there's a third edition that's been updated. Okay. Yeah. Largely the same material, I'm sure. So that'll be just fine for you to go through. Now, let me explain what we're going to do with the textbook. We're actually not going to spend a lot of time each week discussing the reading. The reason for that is because I don't want to take your time just giving you a rehash of something that you've already read. Okay, I believe your reading comprehension skills are probably good enough so that you can read through the material on your own and get the information you need from it. And obviously, since it's in written form, you have the opportunity to go back, read it again if you want to. So we're not going to spend a lot of time discussing it week in and week out. In fact, and so I'm going to be talking about other things because I want to expand on the material that I can expose you to throughout this. But what we are going to do with this each week is when we start class, I am going to randomly call on one of you and just ask you, what was your key takeaway from that chapter? And a key takeaway can be almost anything. It can be something that you already knew, but the chapter reminded you of it. Maybe it was some important principle. You're like, I've known that forever, but this chapter reminded me of it in a great way. Maybe it's an insight you'd never thought of before about teaching, and it just really stuck out with you. Maybe your key takeaway was a question about something that you didn't understand. That's fine too. We can discuss that. We can talk about that. I might be able to shed some light on whatever it was that maybe you didn't understand. All right, now let me explain why I'm going to do that. The reason for that is because, let's be honest, if we have low expectations of ourselves, we're going to end up with what? Low results, right? But I don't believe you want low results out of this seminar. I think you want higher results. And so I'm going to do this as a way of providing just a little bit of accountability for you to try to keep up with the reading, okay? The reading is going to be one chapter a week. All right. So just after tonight, before next Monday night, the assignment will be to read chapter 1. All right. So just one chapter a week, and that'll be my little way of trying to provide a little nudge, a little encouragement for you to prioritize the reading and try to make sure you get to it. Now, I understand, everybody else in here understands that we are all adults. We all have adult responsibilities. And sometimes, try as we might, our best laid plans just don't come to pass, right? You might have every intention of getting the reading done, but you show up on Monday night and you just haven't had a chance to get to it. And so if I call on you and you say, I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance to get the reading done this week. That's okay. That's all right. I mean, nobody is going to be shaming you for that, because again, sometimes our adult responsibilities just get in the way of the things that we might like to do, right? But I hope that just that little thought in the back of your mind, oh, ooh, Tim might call on me tonight. That might be just enough of a nudge for you to say, oh, I'm gonna make sure I have the reading done, and have a little bit of something that I could offer there if he asked me about a key takeaway. So, all right, any questions about the book or how we're going to use it? All right, very good. As I mentioned, I am going to be recording these from week to week. In future weeks, we're not going to record things at first when we're talking about the book. Okay, so if I call on you and you have to say, "I'm sorry, I didn't get the reading done," that's not going to be on a recording, for everybody to see. So no worries about that. We won't start recording until later on in future weeks. All right. I hope you saw the notes there as you came in. I should mention too. I'll let you know. I think I'm going to post the recordings to YouTube. I think that's what I'm going to do. I think that's these are going to be slightly larger, slightly longer videos, and so that's usually the best way to get them. I think so. I'll probably upload them to YouTube and then send a link around. So in future weeks, if you're not able to be here, you can watch those and catch up on whatever you may have missed. All right. So tonight we're going to focus on the why of monologue teaching. Why incorporate monologue teaching into kind of our overall educational teaching approach? The rest of the weeks are going to be focused on how to, right? So we're going to be looking at how to do it, how to start from scratch on preparing a lesson. All right, if that's the opportunity that you're given, and you have the chance to teach on a subject of your choice or a passage of your choice, how do you start from that, or where do you begin? Or if you're starting from a curriculum you already have, how can you start with that information and then develop a good lesson from there using that information that's already given to you in a curriculum? How can you make the best use of that? So we're going to be answering questions like that. Eventually, a few weeks down the road, we're going to focus on all the different types of literature that we find in the Bible. So we'll talk about how to teach a lesson from the narrative passages, how to teach a lesson from the Old Testament prophets, how to teach from the Proverbs and the Psalms. And so we'll get into some of those principles, because sometimes we do have to take a slightly different approach depending on what portion of the Bible that we're in. So we'll talk about that tonight. But tonight I wanted to start with this why question. Why monologue teaching? So I want to make a case for this tonight. to help you understand why monologue teaching can be a valuable tool as we're trying to present biblical truth to people. And the reason I feel the need to do this is because in the broader educational world today, the whole idea of a lecture is kind of quickly being kicked out the door. Now, we're not really trying to give a lecture per se when we're teaching the Bible. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. The difference between what a lecture is and what we are trying to do when we teach the Bible to people. Okay, so we're not necessarily, aiming for a lecture anyway. But sometimes sermons, monologue teaching of any form in a Bible study or whatever also kind of gets caught up in this whole movement to sort of sweep lectures out the door in the broader educational world. I think there's at least one good reason why people have felt the need to reassess the use of a lecture. I also think there is at least one horrible reason for it. And the horrible reason is maybe the most influential one going on in the broader educational world today. The good reason, I think, why some people have felt that it's helpful to kind of reassess lectures is that I think we are becoming more aware of different learning styles, that different people do learn in different ways. And different people retain information more successfully and more efficiently sometimes based on how it's delivered to them. Some people retain more if they're able to read it. Some people retain more if they're able to see it in some fashion. Some people retain more of what they hear. And so I think we have seen good insights from that have made people think, okay, if nothing else, how can we kind of supplement a lecture with some of these other elements to try to make it a little bit more memorable for people? So I think that's a good reason. I really do. But probably what's going on more than anything else in all of this criticism about lectures is just simply the rejection of belief in objective truth. Because in our culture today, objective truth is no longer embraced. That idea is just rejected. What am I talking about? Well, I'm just talking about the whole idea that you have your truth and I have my truth, and the people, the person sitting across the room from you has his truth, and everybody just has their own truth. Now, if that really is the case, then truly it doesn't make any sense for one person to speak to a whole group and say, this is the truth. Because if there's no objective truth, then the truth doesn't actually exist. Again, we'd be in a situation where you have your truth, I have my truth, all of that. And so, again, if that's the case, that we all just have our own truth, then the role of a teacher can no longer be to just present what the truth is. The role of a teacher then just has to become something of a guide to help each person discover what his or her own truth is. And I really think that's the biggest reason why we see in the broader educational context such a strong movement away from the lecture. And unfortunately, I think in some different ways, that mindset is also coming into Bible study settings. And so that's why I feel the need tonight to make a case for the usefulness of monologue teaching, why it is still appropriate, why it is, I think, especially useful in Bible study settings where we certainly should still believe in objective truth. All right, so I'm going to give you 3 reasons here tonight, among others that we could talk of, but we'll talk about these. So, first, number 1, monologue teaching is well suited to achieve the first goal of Bible study. It is well suited to achieve the first goal of Bible study. And what is that first goal? Well, it is to try to answer the question, what point does the author want to make? What point does the author want to make? We'll see this in Haddon Robinson's textbook that when we're trying to boil down a passage into a teachable thought, we're going to be dealing with the question, what is the author talking about? What does he say about what he's talking about? In other words, what's the general subject matter? What's the point he's trying to make about that subject matter? Now, notice how the focus here for the first goal of Bible study is on the author. The focus is on the author. The first goal, the focus is not on me. It's not on you. It's not on us. It's not on what are my opinions about the subject matter. It's not on how does this passage make me feel. Does this passage encourage me? Does this passage inspire me? The first goal is not about any of that. The first goal is focused on the author and the point he's trying to make. So what that means is that to answer this question, we have to focus on things like, what's the vocabulary that the author used? What are the words that he used in this passage? Why did he bring up this subject here at this point? In his whole overall train of thought, how did this connect to what he said just previously? How is he maybe using this to build up to something that he's going to say next? All right, so that requires us to do some very careful study of the passage. What that means for us in a teaching setting is that unless all of the students come in having studied the passage already, then at the beginning of the teaching time, the students are not yet in a good position to answer this question. If the students haven't yet spent time studying the author's words, studying the context of the passage that you're looking at, they're not ready to discuss anything yet. And I don't mean this in an insulting way, but they're in a position of relative ignorance, just in the sense that they haven't yet spent time studying any of this. And so that's why so often in Bible study settings, if we try to start with discussion about the passage, what happens? People are extremely slow to say anything, right? It's because that all of us as students, whenever we're put in that setting, we realize that we're in a position of relative ignorance. We sense the fact that we don't yet have anything very informed to say about the passage. And so what normally happens if we try to start out, if we try to start out a teaching time with discussion, usually what will happen is someone who's been studying the Bible for 40 years will be the first one to speak up, right? someone who maybe at some point has studied the passage or has enough background knowledge that they can say something knowledgeable about the passage. They'll be the first one to speak up. Or it will be the person who feels the most sympathy for the teacher and who doesn't want to see the teacher stand there and squirm as silence just grows longer and longer, right? And so it will be that dear, sweet soul who just wants to break up the silence for the teacher's sake. But since this is the first goal of Bible study, monologue teaching, at least for some stretch of time, can be an excellent way to answer this question. For the teacher to clue in the whole class on the answer to this question right here. Now, depending on what the setting is, that might be 5 minutes of teaching. That might be 10 minutes of teaching. It might be longer. Okay, before maybe then at that point we do bring in discussion, especially when we get to the point of talking about how should the author's point change the way we live. Now we're getting into some really fruitful territory for discussion, right? Because different ones of us might be able to see different ways that this can apply to our lives. But that's down the road a little bit in the Bible study process. So monologue teaching can be extremely valuable for answering that question. All right, number 2 here. It allows a learning moment to stay focused. It allows a learning moment to stay focused. How often do we all find ourselves in conversations where we start out talking about one thing and then somehow we end up talking about why dryers eat socks, right? And we think back over the conversation and we have no idea how we got there. We have no recollection how we got from whatever we started with to dryers eating socks. And so often that's just kind of the nature of dialogue, right? When people are talking, back and forth to each other, and especially when we get into group settings, with each person who's involved in the conversation, the odds go up exponentially of the conversation, shifting all over the place as, someone asks a question. And then that sparks another question off the first question, and then a third question, and then, comments come in. And all of a sudden, the discussion has just gone, to places where no man has gone before, right? And we've probably all been in teaching settings, learning settings, where that's happened, right? And we walk out of there, and in our minds, we think, I have no idea what I was supposed to learn from that. I have no clue how that conversation got from point A to point Y. And we walk out of there in a mental fog. And most likely productive learning probably hasn't taken place. Okay? But here again is one of the strengths of monologue teaching, at least for some stretch of time. Not that it has to take up the entire time, but at least for some stretch of time. Because if there's at least some dedicated time where the teacher is the only one presenting, that creates the opportunity for a thought to be introduced and then developed and then brought to some kind of conclusion and application. So that there's this, we could say that, the opportunity is there to tie the bow on what you're trying to present, and then present it to the students. Again, before maybe there's the opportunity then for discussion at that point. But that opportunity with monologue teaching allows for the full development of an idea to take place before before things might get going far and wide, and and the discussion might go down rabbit trails that leave it kind of lost in the end. All right, the third one here. It gives us the best chance to awaken pathos in our audience. And I'll spell that for you here. It gives us the best chance to awaken pathos in our audience. I'm going to write it down here because as I explain what this is, I'm going to introduce a couple other words that I'll put up here. Okay. So, pathos. This is a Greek word, and the use of this word in the study of persuasive speaking goes all the way back to Aristotle, who actually lived before the time of Christ, by the way. And so, he was living in late Old Testament times. Now, if you know anything at all about Aristotle, you probably think of him as a philosopher. And you think, why on earth was he interested in persuasive speaking? And why did anything that he had to say about persuasive speaking live long enough that I'm about to talk to you about it right now, thousands of years later? Well, it's because, in part, back then, learning and study weren't chopped up quite as much as they are today. Today, you kind of have to pick a field and stick to it, at least if you're going to be considered an expert or anything like that. But back then, thinkers basically thought about whatever seemed significant to them. And so in Aristotle's political philosophy, he saw that persuasive speaking was absolutely necessary for a free society. And the reason for that is because in a free society, which a lot of the Greek cities were trying to be at that time, in a free society, you can't just coerce people to think and act in certain ways, right? Because then you no longer have freedom. Freedom is out the window at that point. And so in a free society, if people are going to think properly and act properly, they have to be persuaded to do that, right? And so that set him off thinking about public persuasive speaking, the value of it, and how to do it well. And he came up with 3 broad observations that other thinkers all the way down to the present time have looked at and said, yeah, he basically got this right as far as looking at these 3 broad categories that we have to be concerned about. Okay, so the first one that he taught, and he wrote this in a short book that's called Rhetoric. And so that's why public speaking often is called rhetoric. All right, and that's how a word like rhetorical question got into our vocabulary. It goes all the way back to that. But the first thing that he identified that we have to be concerned about is ethos. Okay? And you can see how this is similar to our word ethic or ethical. Okay, you can kind of see the similarity there. That's where we get our English word from. And this deals with matters about the person who is speaking. Do I come across as an ethical person? Do I come across as trustworthy? Do I come across as someone that knows what he's talking about? Do I come across as someone who is likable, who is sympathetic to my audience? This also deals with a question like, how am I going to present myself to my audience? What kind of connection am I going to try to establish with them? And we'll see that particular thought of how am I going to present myself to my audience is called a rhetorical stance. Rhetorical stance. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment when we look at an example from the book of James. So that's the first broad category, okay, that he discussed. Details regarding the one who is speaking. All right. Then the second broad category was logos. Logos. And you can kind of see the connection to our word logic here. That's where our word comes from. This deals with the information that's contained in the speech or the lesson, whatever's being presented. This deals with questions of what facts are you going to present? What order are you going to put them in? What's your outline going to be? What's your big idea? What's the main idea that you're going to try to present? All of you at some point probably remember writing essays in school, right? You were supposed to have something like a thesis statement or a main idea, something like that. That's what this whole category deals with, all right? The information we're going to present. Pathos, then, deals with the listeners, the audience, and the concern here with pathos is, how am I going to stir up your passions and emotions so that you will not only understand what I'm trying to say to you, but you'll actually care about it and want to do something about it. So that's the idea. You can see how this is related to a word like sympathy. All right? You can kind of see that root in there. Sympathy. That's when we feel what someone else is feeling, right? When we notice, for example, that someone is suffering, we are moved to have sympathy toward them, right? To feel some of their suffering ourselves. So that's the whole idea with pathos. It is an absolutely crucial element in persuasive speaking, and it's a crucial element in what we are trying to do as well when we teach the Bible. Because we're not trying to just communicate information to people, right? We're not trying to just give, facts and information. There's that element for sure when we're teaching the Bible. And sometimes we have to relay more facts than at other times, right? And that's included in here as well, right? But this is where we find the main difference between a lecture and what we are shooting for when we teach the Bible, because a lecture stops right here. Okay, this is a lecture right here. The speaker and the information. A lecture is an example of informative speaking, right? Maybe some of you have been involved in forensics over the years, or maybe you've had the chance to judge at some of our forensics competitions at school. We have that category of informative speech, right? That's what this is. I'm trying to explain something to you so that you'll gain this knowledge and information. But including this whole idea of trying to stir up the emotions, the passions, trying to drive somebody to care about what we are saying, that is a goal that ought to be involved when we're teaching the Bible. And James chapter 1 is one of the places in particular where we see this. So turn to James chapter 1 with me. James chapter 1. Verses 22 through 25 here remind us of our main goal when we teach the Bible. All right? And this is going to be a great example, great way for us to see an example of all this in action. Now, I don't know if James ever had much of a formal education, but in this letter, he shows that he is an absolute master of rhetoric. He knows not only how to present information, but how to do it in a way that makes it memorable, that makes it get under our saddle a little bit so that we have to do something about it, so that we're not just going to sit on this information, but it's going to keep bugging us until we do something about it. All right, so somebody go ahead, read James chapter 1, verses 22 through 25.
But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does.
All right, thank you, Kelly. So there he tells us what our chief goal ought to be when we teach the Bible. We're not trying to only communicate information to people, right? We don't want our students to leave and be only hearers of the word, do we? Because James tells us if we only hear the word and we think then that we've done all God wants us to do, then we're deceiving ourselves, because he wants us to be doers of the word. He wants us to live it out, right? And so as we teach, we're trying to inspire our students. Anyone who might hear us, we're trying to move their heart so they will act on what we're teaching them, right? So let's look here at how James uses these three categories. And it'll help give us an example um, of just, again, just a masterful use of these three different categories, okay? First off, what is the ethos that James chooses? How does he choose to present himself to his audience? Now, I'm going to go ahead and answer this for you, because it's not quite as obvious just in these verses all by themselves, but in his book as a whole, it becomes very clear the way that he is trying to present himself to his audience is as a loving brother. A loving brother, okay? Take just a moment, glance through the text, and you'll start to see the word brother jump out at you. Brothers, or beloved brothers. He uses it all over the place.
My translation says bro.
It says bro?
I got that updated.
Okay, now there you go. Yep. He says, "Sup, bro? Look, bro, I got something to tell you." But you can probably start to see it. Just a quick glance at the text. All over the place, he's saying, "My brothers, my beloved brothers." Now, this is the rhetorical stance he chooses to use in this letter, because there are other ways he could have presented himself to the audience. For example, he could have presented himself as authority figure, because he was an authority figure to these people. All right. He was essentially one of the pastors of the church in Jerusalem. And so he was a spiritual leader over these people that he's writing to. And so he could have spoken from that perspective, right? Maybe that helps you to see how, when we talk to other people, we do have something of a choice, something of a decision about, okay, how am I going to present myself? What connection am I going to try to establish? But he chose to go for loving brother. And particularly in this passage, I'm going to say he chooses tough love brother, right? Which is an even more specific rhetorical stance, because those of you who have brothers in real life, we interact with our brothers in a lot of different ways, right? Sometimes we encourage our brothers with nice words. Sometimes we say, man, bro, you did such an awesome job in the game today. I'm so proud of you, man. Keep it up. Other times we say, hey, bro, you're being stupid. Knock it off. All right. Sometimes we're tough love, brother, right? And that's kind of how I think he presents himself here in this passage, because he doesn't really pull any punches here. He says, look, you're going to be deceiving yourself if you don't do what I'm calling you to do. All right. Now, what about the logos here? What's his basic subject matter? What's the basic topic he's talking about? Now, I want you to give me the answer. And your first instinct about the answer is probably correct. Okay. So what's the basic subject matter he's talking about?
Action.
Action. Yes, being people of action in our faith, right? Yes, taking action in our faith. Excellent. And that's what his command is all about, right? That's what he's trying to get across here. A command. Take action in your faith. Be doers of the word. All right? So that's the logos. What about the pathos here? How does he try to stir up our emotions? How does he try to stir up our passions? I think he does it one way in verses 23 and 24. And then in verse 25, I think he does it in even a different way. So let's look at those separately. What about verses 23 and 24? What does he do to kind of inject emotion into this? And remember, we have all kinds of emotions in our lives, right? We've got joy, we've got delight, we've got humor, we've got grief, we've got sadness, shame, all these different emotions. All right. So what about there in verses 23 and 24?
What your actions are going to produce, what their actions by hearing the word and being doers of the word produces.
Okay. I'm going to say he gets to that a little bit more in verse 25. Yes,
check.
that's where he gets to. What's that?
Reality check.
Okay. Reality check. I think we're headed in the right direction here. What's that? Okay, self-examination. And in these verses, I think he does it through humor because he presents us with a ridiculous scenario, right? This picture of somebody who goes to the mirror and man, he's just looking intently at his face, right? He's checking himself out in the mirror. And then James says he walks away and he immediately forgets what he was like. That's comical, isn't it? That's ridiculous. We don't do that. If we're going to go to that kind of effort to look at ourselves in the mirror, it's because we want to remember what we look like and take care of anything that might need to be addressed, right? And so what he does, he kind of gets us laughing at the picture of this guy who would look in a mirror and then leave and forget what he looks like. He kind of gets us laughing, but then we realize, wait a second, he's saying the joke's on me because I am that man. If I only hear the word, but I don't do it. So I would say, and this is kind of how I worded it, he uses what I would call a little holy embarrassment. If we are only hearers of the word, he wants us to be a little embarrassed about that. Not because he's trying to shame us for shame's sake, but because he's trying to move us out of that response to the Word of God. So a little embarrassment here for holy purposes, we might say. So that we say, man, I don't want to be like that guy. I don't want to look ridiculous like that guy does. So that's, I think, how he does it in verses 23 and 24. But then what about verse 25? And Linda kind of mentioned it for us here. He talked about it, or she talked about what this kind of living produces. Being a doer of the word produces what? There's a word toward the end of the verse that I think he intends to captivate us. Blessings. Blessings. What does everybody on social media want to be these days? Hashtag blessed, right? I'm hashtag blessed. We all want to think, I am living the blessed life. And James says, here's how you get it. So what he really gives us, he's now drawing on this beautiful, attractive object, the idea of being blessed. And so he kind of stirs up hope and longing. Hope and longing. Where his audience, and then by extension, you and I, can now say, wait a minute, you mean I can be blessed? That's not just for Peter and John and Andrew and Bartholomew and all the other disciples. That's not just for Moses and King David. You mean I can be blessed? Yeah, you can. And then with that realization, then, obviously he wants us to long for that. So that once our hearts realize this is possible for me, then we can say, yes, I want that. And we long for it. We long for that blessing that comes from being doers of the word. And so it's just a masterful example of rhetoric that James uses in here, of how he presents himself a certain way, he talks about a certain topic, and he presents it in a way that stirs our hearts, doesn't it? to where this is no longer just an academic discussion. This is now a presentation that has captivated our hearts and minds, captivated our imaginations to think of ourselves as being blessed. And to bring this all back full circle, to talk about monologue teaching. Monologue teaching gives us the best chance to awaken pathos in our audience. There are several reasons for that. One is because if I'm the only person speaking, then I can inject tremendous emotion into the things I say, just like I'm doing right now with these words. And so this is probably going to be the most memorable thing all night because I'm speaking with tremendous passion, right? And I have the opportunity to do it. If we were having a conversation, it would be really weird for me to speak like this. Wouldn't it? If you're having a dialogue and one person is speaking like this, you're going to think something's gone wrong, right? They're having an argument. This is weird. You don't do that when you dialogue. But if you're the only one speaking, you can express a lot of pathos in order to try to stir up pathos in the people who are listening to you. Also, in monologue teaching, you invariably are going to prepare ahead of time. And that gives you the opportunity not just to talk about a subject, but to think about, how can I say this in a memorable way? How can I word this in a way that's going to stick in their minds? Because let's face it, almost no one can speak that way off the cuff, right? If you're just having a conversation, you're having a dialogue with someone, I mean, you can discuss subjects, but you're not thinking about, okay, how can I make this next statement in a way that's going to be really memorable for the person? We don't think that way off the cuff, right? We also don't think about things like, what's a rich illustration that's going to stick in their minds? We're just not thinking on those tracks when we're having a conversation or a dialogue. But if we know that we're going to have some stretch of time where we're going to get to present this truth, then we can think ahead of time about what's an illustration that might capture their attention. Just like James did, right? He gave us this illustration about the dude looking in the mirror intently and then going away and forgetting what he looks like. We all remember that illustration, right? We remember that picture. It's stuck in our minds. Okay, and when we are teaching in a monologue fashion, we have the opportunity to think about things like that, so that we can include all of the little elements that make truth tasty, right? That make truth palatable, to where we not only hear what the truth is, but then we savor it and we think, oh, yeah, that's nice. Ooh, yeah, absolutely. And we internalize truth then, and it just becomes so much more memorable to us. We can inject those elements when we have a chance to present in a monologue fashion. All right. Well, I hope I have made my case to you tonight for the value of monologue teaching. As I said before, we're going to spend the rest of our weeks talking about the how-tos. How do we do it? How do we sharpen our skills as we're teaching other people? Well, I'll just leave it there for tonight. And then I'll ask you now if you have any questions or thoughts or observations. Okay, if not, well then thanks for coming tonight. And Lord willing, I'll see you next week.
Be prepared to answer on the
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.